Everybody, welcome to this episode of Build It Better. My name's Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at Lady Leet, and I'm joined by my co-host.
That's me, right? Ben Lesh.
See, it's always a toss-up. Like, am I going to say I'm joined by Ben Lesh, or should I just let him do it? I don't know.
Yep, that's true. She leaves me hanging, and then
I'm just trying to make it as awkward as possible.
We could do a montage of awkward introductions of myself.
I'm Ben Lesh.
Allow myself to introduce myself.
Okay, so our guest today is Jay Phelps. Hi, Jay.
Hello, Tracy. Good morning.
Hello.
Neither one of us have ever met you before. Can you tell us something about yourself?
Yeah, never. Like, I don't know who either of you are. We're actually in the same house.
That's right. We're all neighbors in the same model home, so that's good.
We just loved that. Yeah, Tracy got the house first, and Ben and I just loved it so much. We're just like, oh, we got to have that. Even the same piano and couch. Absolutely.
Mine is mirrored. Do you see how my piano is in a different place?
No.
You don't?
No,
I don't.
Oh, maybe it's just for me. It's just for me because I just don't want to look weird.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what it is.
Well, we're going to talk about something really buzzy today. So it's going to get 100,000 views on the YouTubes because it's about re-architecting Netflix, aka Nextflix, which should be your talk title for like every single talk you give, Jay, from now on, with server-driven UI.
Sure. Yeah. Do you want me to just kind of start and talk about what that means and what's going on?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. So so I think we need to kind of explain what server-driven UI is, because it's a terrible name, unfortunately. But we didn't come up with it, and so we're just going to continue to use it. But if you're a web person, it's even harder to understand what server-driven UI is, and I'll explain why in a second. But for a second, set the web aside and pretend you are an iOS developer. Traditionally, in pretty much almost every app, if you're a front-end iOS developer, you're going to design your UI using Swift and your interface builder in Xcode and etc. You're going to design the UI to look in one particular way, and then you're going to fetch data from the server to basically populate that layout and that look, that UI. And so the server is not telling the UI how it's supposed to look. It's just telling the data. It's just telling the UI what to display, not how to display it. Server-driven UI changes that so that the server is not just telling you what to display, it's also telling you how to display it. And so it's a very generic term, because by that I mean that you can have shades of server-driven UI. Like it's a dial that basically, like, you could have it very granular, where it's like, actually that's where the web comes in. Like, the web is basically server-driven UI, like the original server-driven UI. It's just a very extreme version of it, because you've got all the way down to divs. But let's pretend for a second that you didn't have divs and spans. You only had inputs and selects, and then you had tables, and you have chart. Let's say there's a chart component that basically the web probably should already have, and you have these higher level composable components, but you don't have like a div where you can basically lay it out however you want. That's a less extreme, a less granular version of server-driven UI. Or you could even go even more less granular, where you just have sections. Like, you can be like, well, I want you to render section that contains these sort of domain specific charts, or this section that contains whatever. The point is that the server is driving how something should be displayed, but the level of granularity is going to vary depending on your implementation. Some applications, you want it very granular in certain cases, and then sometimes you want it less granular. There's trade-offs. Like, you could think to yourself, oh, well, why wouldn't you always want it to be super granular, because it gives you so much power? Well, the reason is multiple reasons. The biggest one is that it complicates your UI implementation, but also it makes things fairly fragile. You got to be careful. Like if the server is able to create novel, brand new UIs that are very granular, like it's able to construct like at a div level sort of thing, with any kind of style it wants, it's really easy to break your app and not know it. Especially when you've got, as you go through time and your app has progressed and you've added new features, it becomes really hard to test. Is this new thing I'm going to introduce, this new UI, is it going to break in some old version of the app that I'm not testing in my CI? Because you couldn't possibly test your changes in every release you've ever done, like, because after 5 years you're going to have thousands. You could potentially, if you release a lot, have thousands of releases, so it's not practical to test it in all of them. So by going less granular, you add stability and maintainability, but you lose power, right? So it's that trade-off where you have to decide, how granular do I want to make it? And I think for most people, it's a case-by-case basis for a particular, like some pieces of your application might be more granular than others, and that makes total sense. But so in the context of Netflix, it is essentially, so we've been working on a project for about a year or so, and we've talked with other companies. We've talked that are big companies. I don't know if I'm allowed to name them, so I'm just not going to name them. But big companies who also do server-driven UI, to try and learn from their mistakes and then what worked and what didn't work. We've been technically doing server-driven UI, like an ad hoc version of server-driven UI for a long time, like years. Like when we, in a sense, like a very high level version of it, because when the server tells the UI today in all the applications what type of row we should display when you're looking at like the home page. Is it a continue watching row? Is it a list of characters? Is it a list of movies on like iOS now? Like, is it a list of games? Those sorts of things. So we are doing some basic server-driven UI today, but what we're trying to do, our application has grown organically, and I'll pause for a second here, but but our application has grown organically over the last 15 years or whatever, and there hasn't been a case where the UI architecture, the architecture for the contract between the UI and the server there hasn't been a case where we dramatically rethought that, like, hey, we should probably rethink this. And so there's a lot of inconsistencies, as most apps have. There's a lot of inconsistencies between like the discovery experience when you're looking at titles versus like search, or versus other sections of the application. There's some different new sections in like iOS and Android and stuff like that. So that inconsistency though causes maintenance burden on the UIs, and maintenance burden on the backends too, if they're not coordinating and standardizing around how they communicate to the UI, their APIs. That's just extra work that they have to do. So what we're trying to do right now is trying to create a new, what we call paved path, where we've standardized the conventions used between the server and the client and also increase the amount of server drivenness that we have, so that the server has more power to customize how the UI looks. And
So
I'll
why?
stop there for a second.
And then also, like,
So
is
why?
that everywhere down to like CSS as well, or like?
Well, I think this is one thing. I think a lot of our audience is like web developers, and they're gonna miss the fact that like a huge portion of Netflix's UI is not like web. Like it's native clients and TVs and stuff like that.
Exactly. So server-driven UI, like I was saying, that's kind of confusing for web developers, because the web is server-driven UI, and it's just a very granular version of it. Whereas applications like iOS, Android, and our TV app, it's not as server-driven. We also don't have like the ability to like customize. Like on iOS, we haven't historically had the ability to be like, oh, well, we want this to be a different color or in a different location. The UI was relatively
like re-releasing something
with a brand new release. But and there's different ways fix that or to change that. So there's like, you know, there's the over the wire update ability that some apps do. Like, you know, like if you were writing a React Native app, you could do over the wire updates of your JavaScript bundle, right? And that's useful. Don't get me wrong. And that's one approach, and not something, we're not saying that you shouldn't do that or that we're not going to do that. We do it on our TV, for example. But the TV, as an example, actually, there are cases where the TV app doesn't get updated for various reasons. It could be just because the platform's not going to support the newer version because we have some new thing that it's just not going to support. It could be a technical glitch. It could be a limitation of the platform itself, like agreements with the platform saying you can't update your things over the wire. It could be just, we don't know. I mean, there's a long tail of like, who knows why the app for some reason is not being updated. Who knows? It's a gremlin. And in those cases, you lose the ability to modify it, right? And so, but with server-driven UI, you do not lose, well, in theory, do not lose that ability, because if you lost that ability, they wouldn't be able to see anything, because that's what the server is doing, is saying, hey, this is what I want you to display and how I want you to display it. So it gives us some more flexibility. You know, and yeah. And then the other thing is that it can give us the ability to have things like machine learning drive this server-driven stuff. Whereas like app bundles, like that's not really like that. It's not the same thing. Like we could have, and what I mean by that is like your experience is going to be different than Ben's experience. It is today, actually. I mean, today
my experience is going to be better. Just so you know.
Yes,
that's true.
Yes, absolutely.
I guess like the benefit, so does that just mean like you're consolidating, so like different teams? I mean, it's just kind of like the same issue that I feel like a lot of companies have, right? Where it's like, okay, there's so many different versions of applications, which is, you know, why on the web we're like, well, you know, if we use React Native, then we can have like a very similar experience and not maintain multiple code bases, because we can have, you know, iOS and Android. Is that kind of like the same thing for server-driven UI, except just across more devices?
So it's hard to really concretely say yes or no, but I'm going to go no, just to make things simple, and say that like the hardest thing to understand about server-driven UI is that not a lot of people are actually doing a conscious version of it. Like sometimes people will do unconscious versions, like not realize that what they're doing has a term. Someone has coined a term for what they're doing. Aside from like, obviously, like again, the web makes it confusing because the web is server-driven UI. It is. That's how it works. The browser is a rendering engine that has no idea what it's about to display. The server then tells it, hey, I want you to display, like JavaScript makes things confusing, but let's throw away JavaScript for a second and look at just HTML. That's server-driven UI. The server, like if you serve a full HTML page, you know, static site generation or whatever with no JavaScript, the server is saying what it wants you to display, but also telling you how it wants to be displayed. So picture that, but a less granular version, like not able to make low-level like div views or something where you're able to modify, you know, the style completely. That's, you know, if you turn that dial backwards where you've just got components rather than these low-level primitives, that's what most people mean when they say server-driven UI is component level rendering. Like basically your app becomes a component level rendering engine, and so it knows, like it tells the server, hey, I'm able to render a chart, and I'm able to render, you know, a thumbnail, and I'm able to render this row and this billboard or whatever it is that it's able to render. And then the server decides, hey, I want you to render this, and I want you to render it here, you know, in this order. Not necessarily like absolutely positioning, but like relative order sort of thing. You could do absolutely positioning if that's your server-driven, if that's what you want to do for server-driven, and there's probably use cases for that. But most of the time you don't want to go that extreme, because again, the more server-driven you make something, like the more like low-level granular you make it, the more likely your application is going to have stability issues and maintainability issues, because you have to then think about the interactions between things. If you allow someone to completely customize the position of something, it might affect the position of other things, or it might, you know, you might unknowingly create layers, like things are on top of each other and you can't see anything. in some weird, like, if you've got thousands of versions of your app because of releases over time, and you push some server driven, you serve some server driven thing where you're absolutely positioning something, it might be like correct on all the devices except for one. There was some change on that device that you didn't realize they had made, and whoops, now that app is broken on that device. So but yeah, I mean, we're doing this it's a multifaceted re-architecture, in the sense of, one of the reasons we're doing it is to consolidate the APIs. Like right now, historically things have been fairly Wild West, which is normal. Like, your application is going to grow organically. It's better to decouple teams and let them work separately and go at their own paces. But the negative comes with that is that their APIs are going to be different. Their technology is going to be different. And that puts a burden on, mostly the burden comes onto the client, the actual application developers, because then they have to basically deal with the different conventions, and so if you can consolidate those conventions, it just makes the UI a whole lot easier. Like for us, for Netflix, for example, on a lot of platforms, not all of them, but on a lot of platforms, the UI code for like the search page and the UI code for the homepage, even though they look very similar, like they look like, it's a list of movies, they're actually a lot of times not sharing any code at all, both on the client side, but also on the server side. And so that's a maintenance burden, because then when a product manager comes along and says, hey, we want to introduce this new feature, and you're like, oh, well, I can introduce it on homepage, but I can't introduce it on search. They're like, well, why? Like, it looks like the same thing. Why can't you do that? And so it's a tough thing, and it adds maintenance burden and development life cycles and all this stuff. But if we could make it so that, these are just components that are these reusable pieces that the server can then tell us to use, and where it wants us to use them, it just increases that flexibility and allows us to make more richer experiences on the fly. That's the key thing. The difference between, like, we could push a new app bundle, but the problem is then everyone still has the same UI. Like, we want to have the server drive the UI. It needs to be different for everyone. And then, who knows how granular we'll end up. We're making the foundation, the foundational architecture for this to enable us to experiment with more granular server-driven UI. But it's too early to know or guess, I mean, like, how granular we'll go. But, one could imagine, things being very radical. I don't know if we'll ever do this, but, like, things could be very radically different for different people, because some people, as an example, we've got something called To Doom, which is this like news it's almost like a news gossip site for Netflix. Like, it's not gossip, but it's like if you want to learn more about titles or like upcoming things, and like, it's article style stuff. It's actually growing very rapidly, but still probably not well known. It's To Doom. It's TUDUM, and it's named after the Netflix sound. Ta-dum.
That's funny.
But I know a lot of people don't realize it until you actually point it out. It's funny because I would have pronounced it Tadum, but everyone pronounces it Tadoom.
Like
and
Tulum,
so I don't know.
Tulum.
No,
I think we should have a gossip website about Tracy.
I love the gossips because
isn't that Twitter?
With Netflix though, it's like no, it's actually Ben's Instagram DMs is where the real magic happens.
Yep. Oh, it's just the worst. It's just a giant trash fire. No, it's mostly Tracy and I sending back and forth stupid like videos of cats doing dumb things. But
Ben sent me a video of a cat smelling a butt this morning.
Why? That happens all the time.
The cat was not impressed smelling the butt.
No.
I love when they do the head shake.
Or they stick their tongue out like. All right. So the reason I thought we should talk about, because we talk about architecture in the show, and the server-driven architecture thing is because it is unique and it's interesting, because it's one of those, like, Netflix has this interesting problem where they've got different clients on different devices. I would not be surprised to find out Netflix is deployed on a toaster somewhere. Like, it's like everywhere in these weird these weird apps in like different environments, and you've got this problem where there's very similar UIs, and some of them are capable of doing something and some of them aren't, and this solutions come. So like if someone is listening to this and they're like, oh yeah, we've got this app and there's like a VR version and a tablet version and a mobile version and a web version or whatever, but they all need to be kind of similar. I think this is an interesting architectural approach to solving that problem. What are you capable of? Okay, here's some generalized version of what your UI should look like. You figure it out, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and we do so. And just to be very, very clear, because I don't know if I've outright stated this, this is a re-architecture for all platforms, for iOS, Android, TV, and web. I'm working on in like what we call a working group within the company, where it's a group of just people from the different platforms. I'm representing TV and web because they both use React. And we're collectively designing this re-architecture together, both with there's a group of server people who do the page generation stuff today.
Who are the meanest? Which group?
The server people. Always the server people are the grumpiest people. They're made of servers. That's why they're called server people.
Ben with the dad joke.
I guess you can't say. You can drop into our Instagram DMs.
No, I literally, this is the funnest project I've ever worked on in my entire life. Like
it sounds like a lot of fun.
Because the project itself is fun. The people, honestly, the people make it really the funnest. Everyone that I'm working with has been at Netflix for a while, and they're very experienced. They're very sharp. It's a great, very collaborative discussions. And so it's been a really fun process, but it's been, it's tough. We're trying to make a decision that's going to impact us for the next 10 years or plus, maybe even longer than 10 years. And so we're making a lot of decisions, making a lot of trade-offs.
Sounds like having a baby when you put it like that.
So like no implementation yet, just like talking.
No, actually, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. We're far enough along that we have implementations. Okay. Android is leading the way on prototyping, and the other devices have done some initial prototyping as well, but not as full bore. But
it's just going to be like an incremental type of like migration adoption towards this path.
Yeah. I mean, there is there's somewhat incrementalness. I mean, but fundamentally, you somewhat have to like some platforms are going to do the V1 where they take their existing UI and bolt it to the new convention. Kind of like what they've been doing, honestly, historically, which is like the backend people will be like, hey, we have some new service to serve this, to generate the search results. Like what just happened honestly just a few years ago, they were like, hey, here's the new API for generating search results, figure it out. And most platforms just basically didn't re-architect how their UI worked. They just like mapped the old data or the new data to the old data, basically, so that they had to make the minimal amount of changes and they could make it in like one spot or ish. And that's the easy way to do it, but that adds tech debt, maintenance burden, because you've got two competing conventions. You got the convention they're actually giving you, and then the convention that the UI actually uses that you mapped to. So in the long run, you want to have the UI adopt what the server directly without a mapping. And so some platforms are going to it's case by case. Where Netflix is very not top down, so it's up to the device platform teams to decide how they want to do or how they're going to do this rollout. Where we work with them, I'm on basically a shared client foundations team, and so
whenever
it's our job.
Whenever I hear that Netflix is not top down or some company's not top down, I was thinking to myself, that means they're bottoms up.
Bottoms up.
I mean, realistically, if it's not tops down,
we are bottomed up. Yeah. We're drunk. Yep. That's how it works.
They need to add a feature for Tracy to Netflix where she can go through where she's watching movies, and if there's any scene at all where there's a cat sniffing a butt, she can like send that to me.
Okay, here's the thing though, Jay, like are you like disqualified from applying for like things like Love is Blind? Because
I am.
Are you?
Yep, as a
That is so
I
annoying.
am, and any of my anyone who lives with me or is related to me.
Okay, server-driven UI, where did it come from? Where did the term come from?
I actually don't know who coined the term.
Hmm.
It's not a well-known term, but it is a term. Like, if you Google server-driven UI, you're gonna find you're gonna find articles from places like Airbnb is a big one that does
Okay.
a lot of server-driven UI. Um, and
So all the cool kids are
yeah.
doing.
Yeah,
server-driven
Airbnb
UI.
does that when they're not like trying to ruin your life with their lint rules. That's the only other
right,
thing.
definitely. Yeah. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
Oh man.
They're like, here's some lit rules that prevent you from writing any code.
Yes. What are the rules that make you the least productive and cause the most amount of arguments during your pull requests?
It's so
you all feel that way?
I hate it.
Yes, absolutely.
I hate it. It makes me want to
Really?
stab myself in the eye every single time.
Everybody's adopting it, right?
Oh,
or
God,
like
I
a
hope
large majority of people are adopting it.
Because of boilerplates. The boilerplates all included it, and so it like proliferated, and so it's like, oh.
We should make our own lint rules, Jay, called like Air Ben and Jay, and it's just like the ESLint Air Ben and Jay rules, and like the suite would just be like, if you write any code at all, you get red squigglies. It's just
everything is just red squigglies.
Like just random complaints. I don't like this variable name.
Why isn't this a butt sniffing a monkey? Wait, a monkey sniffing a butt.
Exactly.
Butt sniffing a monkey.
I mean, that could happen too, Well, we're going to have Jay back on the show multiple times throughout the year. And maybe he can talk to us about, other stuff. But since you can't
I also think it'd be fun, to one of the things I'm looking forward to is this is a risky project. Like, this is a big multi-year risky project that we hope pays off, and I'll be the first to admit that if it doesn't pay off. But I think it'll be interesting to kind of have a retrospective on this at some point.
Yeah. Well, we'll have you on more, obviously, and you can follow Jay on Twitter since you can't find him on Instagram. So _Jay Phelps. Ben, you can follow at Ben Lesh.
I'll do it.
He's also on Instagram. You can slide into his DMs. And you can find me on Twitter at Lady Leet. So we're excited though, Jay. We'll have you on soon again.
Cool. Thanks for having me all.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye-bye, y'all.
Y'all soon.